one black professor, no courses in African American studies, and in which in my 4 years as an undergraduate, not one book by a black author was offered in any course. So to come to an event here, sponsored by the Institute of African American Studies, is such a profound experience, especially because I remember the first time I walked into this library, so intimidated by all the names above it and the stained glass windows and all the books. But in spite of that, I was part of a group of people who made history and brought that history that was not here into here. And Farah and everybody else, what you've done, it's a wonderful feeling to see where Columbia Butler Library has come and to be at this event. And I know Stretch would have liked that transition, so this is for you, man. We were there at the same time, and this is your legacy. So I'm going to talk about Stretch Johnson, the political activist. But first I want to describe to you how I first met him and his impact on my own work. In 1976, I got my degree from Columbia for a dissertation called The Communist Party in Harlem from 1928 to 1936. And for the book, I was going to expand it to 1941 under the direction of the incredible, brutal August Meyer, who was going to make sure that I left no stone unturned to find every source and interview every person. So people told me there was this former communist youth leader who is now the head of Black Studies at SUNY New Paltz. I was at that time in the Institute of Afro-American Studies at Fordham, and my colleagues all knew about Stretch Johnson, who had been a legendary figure in the Upward Bound program and was known as a Black Studies chair for his outreach to local communities, for feeling that it was the responsibility of his department and the university to reach out to all the black communities of the Hudson Valley and for their struggles to be there. So he came very highly recommended, and I come into the office and I meet this person who lit up a room. I spent 4 hours with him. It was all taped, but he was talking about his experience as a communist organizer, and he made it sound like fun. And then I suddenly realized we associate communism with rigid discipline, grim-faced, humorless, organizing according to some recipe book made in Moscow. And none of that described Stretch Johnson. He was funny, he was wise, he was sensitive, and he also talked about a movement that reached into every corner of the community. The church people, the people in the Garvey movement, the street kids who were in and out of gangs, the musicians, the intellectuals, the students. This movement reached them all at one point in history. And to understand how important this organization was in Harlem, Adam Clayton Powell was the first city councilman of African descent ever elected. His hand-picked successor was Ben Davis from the Communist Party. That shows how powerful this movement was in that community. And Stretch Johnson was one of the people who made it that way. And so I want to talk a little bit about it. What Kevin said really is a beautiful segue into it. What does it mean that somebody with his connections to the cultural leadership of the African American community, the art, becomes a communist, and what that decision involved? And I think this book, which is a remarkable book in many ways, it's almost like a middle-class version of the autobiography of Malcolm X. The passage messages about his youth in this mixed-race black community in New Jersey are, to me, priceless for showing how people can be part of a community, and yet white supremacy puts doors that block them from what otherwise would be normal activity. So he goes to an integrated school, he's a star athlete, he's a star student, teachers take him under their wing, but when it comes to getting work, he can only get work as like a waiter or a cook. There is nothing but service work available. He's part of this society, and yet, you know, these barriers come down. And then he comes to Harlem and becomes part of the Cotton Club. Now, as you described, Kevin, the entertainers in the Cotton Club were an elite in the black community, but they were exoticized, eroticized, and exploited in all kinds of extraordinary ways, and were forced to do things their white counterparts weren't, one of which was sell sex for money. And when I read this manuscript, I kept thinking of Manning Marable's biography of Malcolm X, and Manning was a friend of mine. And the way he was attacked after he passed for suggesting that Malcolm X might have had a relationship with a wealthy white man that involved some sort of sexual activity. And Stretch in this book described this, as a matter of fact, was the kind of thing we did to make money at that time. It was normalized. But it also reflected the way these incredibly talented people, and Kevin, all the things you've read, were deprived of their dignity, their self-respect, and seen through a lens that caricatured them. No matter how talented they were, no matter how well paid they were, they became the stuff of fantasy and caricature at the same time. And, Stretch had, because of his background, had some of the intellectual distance from that to know that. But then the fact that there was this Communist Party in the community which didn't do that. The Communist Party had its own issues with race, and which Stretch goes into a little bit, and which some other former communists have talked about, but eroticizing black people was not one of them. The dignity of black culture, its historic connection to everything that was positive in American culture, was part of the party's message, along with the imperative that the only way a white communist could fight for social justice was by fighting white supremacy. This was a party that put whites on trial for white chauvinism in public in Harlem, which expelled people for acts which in all other parts of white America were considered normal. And so, for this brilliant man who was in white society and yet never fully embraced, to see people who were not only moving back the furniture of evictive people and marching for the Scottsboro Boys, but insisted that black culture was the basis of all that was positive in American culture. And that was very much part of what communists were preaching, especially in the late 30s when Stretch joined the party. And if you study Paul Robeson, as I have, that is the message, in all his speeches, when he comes back to the United States in 1939, in all his music, that American culture is based upon a foundation of black culture. And until we recognize it, we don't know who we are, and we degrade and disrespect this foundational influence in our world. So Stretch finds a place that he can escape everything that he experienced in the Cotton Club and fight against it. He describes the drawbacks of it, the way that Soviet influences can sabotage all the positive things that were happening. Some of the rigidities. But the bottom line is Stretch was not the only incredibly talented African-American intellectual or artist to gravitate to this movement. And he describes in his book all the amazingly talented people of African descent who joined the party and helped make it a force in this community. And the thing about what communists did is what they did alone then began to spread into other portions of the American, political spectrum. Into the NAACP, got more courage in terms of fighting racism in the streets as well as the courts because of this. Many religious groups began challenging racism more aggressively. So when Stretch joined the group that went out front and which changed the course of history. And you could see when you talk to him how you could do that. This, when you were describing Wendy, everybody in Harlem knew him. That was the way it was with Ben Davis. Go back to a time when communists could be welcomed from every storefront, church, street meeting, kids playing stickball. They all knew them. And eventually, this movement was crushed. It was crushed as soon as World War II ended, even though many communists like Stretch were heroes in the military. In a racist military where they fought, and so many African Americans fought to have the opportunity to actually have an equal role in the military, where many white communists volunteered for the most dangerous missions behind enemy lines and were dropped in to work with the underground in many countries in Europe because the undergrounds were led by communists in Italy, in Greece, in Eastern Europe. So these, once the Soviet Union became an enemy of the United States, this movement was marginalized and eventually crushed. But the spirit of the people in it were not. And that's, what was clear to me, it wasn't only interviewing Stretch. I interviewed many African-American communists, William Patterson, Louise Thompson, Abner Berry, Ted Bassett. To some people here, those will be familiar names. None of the people who I interviewed were crushed, but Stretch was different because he was still like he was walking the streets of Harlem in 1939 or 1942. He was still dangerous at SUNY New Paltz in 1977 because he was organizing in Poughkeepsie and Kingston and all those communities where there were black communities who were still, isolated and marginalized economically and socially. Newburgh, New York, another famous example of that. So here he was, he reinvents himself after he leaves, goes to Columbia, he's a printer, then he ends up in the Upward Bound program in Black Studies. But what I think the message to me is, nothing is lost when you sacrifice for justice. That there is a continuity there. And what I hope this book will do is inspire a new generation of people to take up this fight. Because the fight is not over by any means. And I could talk about this university and its role in the gentrification of the Upper West Side in Harlem for days, but I won't. But I'll mention it because Stretch would want me to. Reading the sections of this book could tell anybody how to organize. That's one of the great things about this book. It's portion of it is an organizer manual. You know, whether in Harlem, whether in the military, whether in a veterans organization, you couldn't find a better person to tell you how to organize large groups of people, different people together, than Stretch Johnson. And I want to say something about this book, because some books make a big splash when they come out. This one is going to have a very long shelf life. There are all sorts of things, gems in this book. You know, I mean, Kevin has pointed out the whole view of the Cotton Club years, and a window into that, you know, eroticized and exoticized Harlem cultural scene. There's also, in the beginning, this whole discussion of mixed race peoples in New Jersey and Rockland County, the Ramapo Mountain people, which and then all these communities, small African-American communities in New Jersey. Paul Robeson was part of one of those communities, who go to integrated schools, but the color line is drawn in all these interesting ways. There's a lot to follow up there, I think. And then there is the whole issue of African Americans in World War II, which both in the military and in the Jim Crow military camps, that needs to really be explored, because a lot of what later becomes the Southern Civil Rights Movement is deeply influenced by the experience of African Americans in the military, and how many came out of that experience having actually won some battles in these very difficult circumstances. Even Jackie Robinson, if any of you have seen the movie 42, that experience of speaking up and speaking out in the military helped prepare him for that heroic and difficult task of integrating Major League Baseball. So I just want to say how proud I am to be associated with this amazing book. I urge you all to read it. For those of you who are scholars, to use it in your courses, to encourage your students who are doing research to build on this. And then to those of you that are organizers or have students who are organizers, tell them to read this so they can become better organizers. So, Stretch, you're still here with me. My book would have never been anything like what it was without not just what you told me, but what I experienced knowing you as a friend. So everybody, let's celebrate and let's use this book. Thank you very much.